What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. Okay, so as we get into Avengers Volume 1 from Marvel Now 2.0, this deals a lot with time. In fact, it deals entirely with time, and it actually deals with a villain named Kang the Conqueror. And a lot of fans love Kang the Conqueror. I never found him particularly interesting, but this story is written extremely well, and I absolutely love the way it was done by Mark Waid. But before we get into this, what I want to do is I want to talk about how time functions in Marvel Comics. So for the most part in Marvel, there's two different types of time. There's what's called linear time, and then there's what's called branch universe theory. Now, that sounds confusing, but it's not. It's the simplest thing to understand. Linear time is that there is one single timeline, and that's it. There's one universe, one timeline, and that's all there is to it. Now, what this does is it creates something called a paradox. Let's say, for example, that you traveled back into the past and met your dad when your dad was a little kid, and then you did something stupid and you got your dad killed. Well, then the question becomes, if your dad died before you were born, then how could you have been born in order to go back in time in the first place? That's the issue with a linear timeline, is that it creates paradoxes, it creates problems. Now, Marvel could be saddled with this, but what Marvel does is they use something called branch universe theory. So what Marvel will say is that let's take the DC effect. Let's take like Earth 1. All right, we'll just use the DC numbering. Let's say that right now, you watching this video right now takes place in Earth 1. All right, and you're like, you know what? I think I am going to travel back in time because for whatever reason you have time travel powers. You say, I am going to travel back in time and I'm going to go see my dad when he's a little kid. You get your dad killed. Well, then the question is, how in the world did you manage to travel back in time in order to meet your dad if your dad had died before you were born? Those two things don't add up. It doesn't make any sense. And so what Marvel does is they say, okay, because of the fact that you traveled back in time, the instant you did that, what it did is it took the future that you came from and put it into Earth 2. It's now a different universe. And so what you did is you traveled into the past and then crossed over to a different universe to meet your dad for the first time. And so that's basically what they say. That's really what Marvel uses when it comes to branch universe theory. Hopefully that's pretty easy to understand. It should be. I mean, I don't really know how to explain it any simpler than that. But the idea here is that with regards to Kang the Conqueror, what Marvel establishes here, really what Mark Waid's doing, is he's consolidating a lot of things. And the reason why is because over the course of Marvel's publication history, Kang the Conqueror has fought the Avengers, the Fantastic Four. He's fought virtually everybody. That's really one of the reasons why a lot of fans like him, is because he's appeared in almost every single story belonging to anybody, and he basically just uses information and technology from the future to just run an absolute muck. The problem with this is that there are so many different iterations of Kang the Conqueror, no one ever bothered to consolidate them. And so you'd be fighting Kang the Conqueror, or you'd see Kang the Conqueror, then you'd see Scarlet Centurion, and it's just like, well, it's a version of Kang the Conqueror from somewhere, and that would be it. That'd be all you would get. There'd be no real information given to us. What Mark Waid does here is, while he doesn't necessarily flesh out every version of Kang the Conqueror, what he does do is he establishes where they come from. And what he says here is that each time Kang the Conqueror traveled into the past and fought the Fantastic Four, it created a new universe. And in that new universe, Kang the Conqueror went on to become somebody else. That was every single circumstance. When he fought the X-Men, it made a new universe. When he fought Spider-Man, it made a new universe. The Avengers, every single time he traveled into the past, he made a new universe. Now, within the realm of Marvel, while there are all these different versions of the Kang the Conqueror, there's what's called Kang Prime. And Kang Prime is the main guy. And all he does is sit at the very end of time. You know, when the universe is about to be destroyed, when it's about to die, whatever the case may be. But at the very end of time, when everything begins to come to a close, Kang the Conqueror is just sitting there. And all he's doing is feeding on all this energy, all these different paradoxes that he's created whenever he traveled back through time. And so what this origin story does is it tells us how he got there. And so what it does is it picks up when Kang was a young man, this main Kang, this Kang Prime, when he was a young man. And what we find out is that in the future that he comes from, time travel is basically forbidden. And, you know, delving into time, investigating time, it's all completely forbidden. And the reason why is because if a person were to travel back and forth through time, not knowing what it is that they're doing, they could cause all kinds of problems. And so because of this, Kang the Conqueror effectively broke the rules, used the information stored within Dr. Doom's time platform, and began investigating time. The first trip he took into the past came in the form of him making himself a pharaoh. So for those of you guys who are familiar with the origin story of Apocalypse, this is where that comes into play. Now, his motivation for traveling into the past, when the Apocalypse origin first came out, his motivation was rooted in making Apocalypse his heir. What Mark Waid does is Mark Waid comes along and says, that's the case case to a degree, but Kang the Conqueror is also curious about, Egyptian legends of immortality, different things like that, just wanting to actually see what the past was like. The problem is that when he arrived in the past and he had all this technology, the people viewed him as a god. He became overwhelmed with power and basically became corrupted by it and began the path of becoming a bad guy. From here, he began just jumping around at different points in time, and what he began doing was basically creating these different caches of sorts. What he would do is he would go to one planet or something like that within the universe, and he would basically set it up so that all that planet would do is manufacture weapons for Kang the Conqueror to use. He would go to another location, and that location would exist to do nothing more than mine resources that Kang the Conqueror could then turn around and use for currency. And so that's how he basically, kept himself going. That's how he kept his plans and machinations constantly available to him, was by having a virtually endless source of weapons and money. And so eventually the time came when Kang the Conqueror began to realize that all the weapons he had made came crumbling down. All the different minerals, all the different mines that he had made basically began to disappear. And what this indicates is that someone is jumping around through time and destroying all these things that Kang the Conqueror made in the past. And so imagine that you basically traveled to 20 years ago and then you created a pencil, and you set that pencil on a desk or something like that. You travel 20 years into the future, back to the present day, you look at the pencil on that desk, and then suddenly that pencil vanishes. The reason why is because someone moved it as soon as you put it there in the past. That's really what's happening here, is somebody's screwing with the past to mess up Kang the Conqueror's future. And what we end up finding out is that this is being done by the Avengers themselves. And in fact, it's not just the main Avengers, it's multiple eras of the Avengers. The original Avengers back in the 1960s, the second iteration of the Avengers in the 1970s, and the modern day Avengers. And so what this does is it, of course, allows us to kind of jump back to the beginning of the story and make sense of everything that's going on. So hopefully I didn't blow your minds too much. I mean, that's really about as confusing as any of this is going to get. But if you have questions, feel free to post them. There may be some of you guys who are a little unsure about what's going on, but essentially the long and short of everything I just told you is that the Avengers are basically going throughout the time stream and screwing up Kang the Conqueror's future. That's basically all they're doing. They're basically trying to keep him from existing. Now, the reason why this is happening is actually not because Kang the Conqueror is attacking the Avengers, but because the Avengers initiated a conflict with Kang the Conqueror. Specifically, it was actually Vision who started it. Now, the reason why is because of the fact that in their last encounter, the Vision began to go through all these different scenarios on why it is that Kang the Conqueror is the way he is. And what Vision basically realized is that there will come a point when Kang the Conqueror will just be born. The choices that he will make, the road that he will follow, will lead him to becoming the villain that the Avengers have faced off against time and time again. And so Vision's idea was to basically alter the future by taking the baby away from the road that it would have been on. And so Vision literally kidnapped Kang the Conqueror as a kid, whisked it away to some place in time that we have no idea where it is, in hopes that that child would grow up to become someone other than Kang the Conqueror. And so because of this, these changes are still taking place. These changes are still more or less happening. And so because of that, these versions of Kang have not necessarily been affected yet. And the reason why is because of the fact that if you saw my video on Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four, one of the things that he established was that if you go into the past and you change something, the change is not immediate. Instead, it's like a wave making its way through time. It takes time to get to the person that is supposed to affect. And so it's not like you would go back and shoot Kang as a kid and then he would suddenly just vanish. What it would do is it would take time. The ripple effect would have to get to Kang. Sometimes it would take minutes, sometimes it would take days or hours, or whatever the case may be, because we're messing with the concept of time and everything is sort of relative. But at this moment right now, the way the story is written, these changes have not affected Kang the Conqueror yet in the extreme. Instead, what's happening is the Avengers are basically fighting off a multitude of Kang's different versions. So like Scarlet Centurion, one version of Kang the Conqueror, different things like that. Now, the Avengers are able to hold their own to a degree. I mean, they're able to do pretty well, basically fighting against two versions of Kang the Conqueror. The issue is that one of these versions of Kang basically begins to interrogate the Vision. And the reason why is because they're both aware of the fact that the Vision was the one who stole Kang when he was a baby and moved him to a different location. And so because of this, their question is, where did you take him? Because if this wave of change gets to us before things are set back to the way they're supposed to be, then these versions of Kang will simply cease to exist. So this story is quite literally a race against time. Now, because of the fact that they basically delve into the mind of Vision only to find that Vision had basically dumped his memory of where it is that he put this kid, he basically made himself forget. The idea here is for these different versions of Kang the Conqueror to start from Vision in the present to basically manipulate the time stream to travel backwards in time and look at everything that the Vision did in order to find out where he put this baby. So it's actually a really simple and a really smart maneuver, and it works pretty well. The downside downside of the way that Mark Waid writes this is he does it in a really confusing way. He really writes it in a way that's a lot more complicated than it needs to be, but that's essentially what this is, and that's really why I'm kind of trying to simplify it as best I can, because it could have been a lot simpler. The other half of this equation is that in Kang's mind, while they're basically trying to track down the baby, what they realize is the Avengers are going to try to step in and stop them every step of the way. And so what happens is Kang the Conqueror actually begins going back in time and essentially going to Peter Parker, going to Jane Foster, going to Sam Wilson the moment that they're born when they're babies, and begins the process of killing them all off in order to make sure that they never become Avengers in the first place, thereby never challenging Kang the Conqueror in the current day. And so because of this, while this wave of change begins to approach the Avengers and begins to wipe them out, they're all essentially whisked away. And what we end up finding out here is that the reason why they were whisked away is because they were sent to a place called Limbo. Now, Mark Waid uses the phrase limbo with a grain of salt. And the reason why is because in Marvel Comics, there is an actual dimension called Limbo. There is an actual place, but it's not a place outside of all space and time. I mean, it kind of is, but it kind of isn't. What Mark Waid's doing here is he's basically saying, when he says limbo, all he's really saying is that somebody took the Avengers out of all space and time. And so what this means is that if they were to go back to the universe, if they were to go back to the main Marvel universe, then they would suddenly vanish. And the reason why is because that wave of change would overcome them, and because they were killed as infants, they would simply cease to exist. And so again, we basically end up finding out here that the person that moved them out of this universe, that moved them away, was actually a version of Kang the Conqueror himself, who exists outside of all space and time. So that's why things get really, really crazy with this story. It's great and it's really good, but it can really be mind-blowing in some ways. And that's why I say Mark Waid, his writing style is a little complicated. Now, with regards to this wave of change that's going through, the only person who's not affected is Hercules. And the reason why is because no one knows when Hercules was born or where. He was simply just there one day. And so Kang the Conqueror didn't have the ability to go into the past and kill Hercules as a baby because he didn't know when he was supposed to go. He didn't know where he was supposed to go, what year Hercules was born, or anything like that. And so there was really no way he could stop this. And so what ends up happening is he actually contacts a woman named Sybil. Now, this is a cool thing because remember, in Marvel Comics, you have Greek gods, you have Greek goddesses. They're similar, but a little bit different to what DC does with Wonder Woman. Sybil is basically an oracle, a person that can see the future. And so because of this, Sybil actually gives Hercules an artifact that allows him to stay anchored to the present so that they can kind of jump back and forth through time without getting lost in time itself. What we also end up finding out is that where this baby Kang was sent was actually to a place, it was a temple in Vietnam that belongs to the priests of Pama. Now, the priests of Pama are a group in Marvel Comics that have existed for quite some time, but they're by nature a pacifist race. And the reason why is because of the fact that during the days of, the Kree and the Skrulls and their whole warring faction and all that kind of good stuff where they fought for, millennia and millennia, what ended up happening is the priests of Pama actually vacated that entire territory and began going in 2x2s to different planets and then basically, procreating and expanding their own group. But some of them actually arrived on Earth and have basically existed in shadow for countless years. Now, they've been around for a long time. I really want to say since like 1974, but they've been used sparingly, and it's really just a way for Mark Waid to invoke an extremely obscure group and bring them into the equation. But the fact remains here, with Hercules attaining this artifact that will basically keep the Avengers anchored in the modern day, despite the fact that their younger selves have been totally obliterated, what ends up happening here is he finds the location of baby Kang, fights against, Kang the Conqueror and Scarlet Centurion when they arrive at the Priest of Pama's location, the Priest of Pama's temple. And then of course we also have the Avengers arriving on the scene because they're allowed to be anchored to this amulet. And so think about it this way, if the wave of change in the timeline were actual water, the amulet that Hercules is wearing is like throwing a lifeboat to them. It's like throwing a life vest or something like that. It's something the Avengers can hold on to keep from being whisked away. So the fact remains here, at this point, it's really just kind of them facing off against these different versions of Kang. And we don't really need to get super in depth there because what it ended up doing is making things a bit more confusing than they need to be. But it's basically them just kind of fighting against Kang here and there. But what ends up happening is Vision basically goes to Nadia Pym, again, who's currently Wasp in Marvel Comics, and simply says, your job is to take this little version of Kang and send it back to where it's supposed to be. The mistake that I made was removing it from its current universe, or removing it from its time. You have to set things back to the way they're supposed to be. And so of course, that's really just her mission. And at this point, it's just the Avengers facing off against these different versions of Kang. And that's really about it. I mean, there's not a whole lot to go on here. It's just them kind of facing off against Kang the Conqueror. And so because of this, once she returns to the modern day, once she comes back to the present, what ends up happening is the Avengers sit down and they say, okay, look, the Vision took baby Kang away. It resulted in these different versions of Kang the Conqueror descending on us in order to try to get the baby back. The baby is back where it's supposed to be. Now Kang, all these different versions of Kang want to kill us so we can never do it again. And so what ends up happening here is Sam Wilson comes up with an idea. And Sam Wilson's idea is to basically travel along this time stream to these different caches that Kang the Conqueror uses to keep himself alive and obliterate them in their entirety so that Kang the Conqueror will simply cease to exist. And so because of that, we also are basically visited by a version of Vision from the future. God, this is getting crazy. Mark Waid's storytelling is absolutely nuts. But what basically ends up happening here is that this future version of the Vision essentially says, look guys, here's where things stand right now. All right, what we're going to do is we're basically going to jump into this time stream. All right, we're going to go to 3 different locations across the time stream. We're going to destroy Kang the Conqueror's weapon cache. We're going to destroy Kang the Conqueror's system for generating money. And then that means that the other versions of Kang the Conqueror that exist are simply not going to be able to function. They're going to cease to exist because the methods they use to keep themselves alive are not going to be there. Because of that, what it's going to do is it's basically going to render down all the different versions of Kang the Conqueror to the point that they simply cease to exist. And there's only ever going to be that one future of Kang. And so what ends up happening is they say, as long as we achieve this goal, as long as we basically destroy this connection that Kang has to the entire time stream, then once it all goes down, that version of Kang the Conqueror will cease to exist because he won't be able to feed on the time stream. It'll basically be like depriving you of water or food or something like that. You'll simply starve to death. And so this is exactly what happens. They basically travel to 3 different points in time. Now, we don't need to go through all the different locations that they go to. It's just in general 3 different points in time. And for the most part, they're successful in destroying all 3 of these different points. The problem with this is that what the Avengers don't realize is that with Kang the Conqueror being all the way at the very end of time, it's going to take a while for this whole thing to basically catch up with Kang the Conqueror himself. And so because of this, it affords him the opportunity with his other personalities, with Immortus, who's also a guy who can manipulate time, with a future version of Kang the Conqueror who's become Dr. Doom. It allows these different guys to traverse the timeline and then go back and stop the Avengers before they're able to pull all this off. And so what ends up happening is Hank Pym from the first Avengers team is able to harness a device that's able to basically absorb Kang the Conqueror, Immortus, and this version of Dr. Doom and keep them in stasis, basically keep them hidden away from the rest of the universe. And so what's essentially happened here is Mark Waid has come along and said, where there were all these different versions of Kang and all these different things were going on, it was wildly complicated and unnecessarily convoluted, Hank Pym has effectively saved the universe. Because what happens now is all we have right now in the realm of Marvel Comics is Baby Kang. That's it. Baby Kang sleeping in his crib, and that's all there is to it. There is no future version of Kang the Conqueror. There's no Immortus, none of that stuff. It's a way for Mark Waid to basically clean all that out, to remove it all from the situation, and to simply say, now the future of Kang the Conqueror is completely open. No one knows what the future holds for him. No one knows what he will become. Having said that, I understand if a lot of you guys feel like your brain is melted because of what we went through, and there will probably be a lot of questions. So if there are, post them down in the comment section. Again, Mark Waid makes this a lot more complicated than it needs to be. I did my absolute best to make it make sense. This was one of those things where we kind of had to just like set aside the idea of focusing on what the characters are thinking and feeling and just make sense of the events as they're transpiring, because it's the only way to make this story make sense. Otherwise it would have just thrown everybody off. But if you guys are new here to Comics Explained and you again feel a bit confused, post your comments down below, hit that sub button to become part of the Rob Corps, and drop a like if you enjoyed this video. And yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace.